This is BBC Radio 4, where it's time now for Any Questions with Chris Mason.
Hi, we are in Stoke-on-Trent this weekend. We're at St Joseph's College, a mixed selective secondary school with around 1,150 students. The school celebrates its 90th birthday next year, and I'm told that that moment will be marked with one of those, let's hope everyone's looking at the camera at the same time, all-school photos. With us on the stage here, in front of what I reckon is our biggest live audience since we came back out on the road in May, about 200 people, a Staffordshire MP for nearly 30 years, the Conservative Michael Fabricant, Francis O'Grady, the General Secretary of the Trades Union Congress, a collection of 48 member unions representing 5.5 million workers, the Labour MP Shabana Mahmood, her party's national campaign coordinator, and the comedian and commentator Geoff Norcott, who's written the book Where Did I Go Right? How the Left Lost Me. Stoke, your Any Questions panel. First question from Deborah Mallender. Hello, Deborah.
Hello, thank you for having me. Does Staffordshire have the worst of all worlds with HS2, given the destruction of our ancient woodland and no net biodiversity gain?
Thank you, Deborah. So the news this week about HS2 not being quite as extensive as was originally planned, and people in Staffordshire pointing out to me that it has an impact here, but there aren't necessarily many places to get on or off it as and when it does arrive. Michael Fabricant is a Staffordshire MP first.
Well, I have to say that since the announcement was made of the change to the eastern leg of HS2, I've been flooded with letters from people in the Lichfield constituency in the south of Staffordshire, all saying, well, why can't we get them to cancel the western leg? And the reason is it's the point that the person in the audience said, the destruction of ancient woodlands and the fact that HS2 is blundering through beautiful countryside and places like Lichfield aren't served. I would also say it could have been done so much better. The original proposal would have had HS2 going into main railway stations like Birmingham New Street instead of a lovely but nevertheless standalone station in another part of Birmingham. It would have connected originally with HS1, which would have meant, for example, my constituents would be able to go to Birmingham New Street, change platforms, and end up in Paris directly. Now they have to change stations in Birmingham, change stations again in London, until they get finally to France. Look, there are big advantages. It will provide levelling up, but I am disappointed with the way HS2 has been designed. I think it is damaging the environment, and to answer your question directly, and we haven't been colluding beforehand, in Staffordshire, I don't think we're getting that great a deal out of it, actually.
And Michael, on the bigger picture, you used the phrase there, levelling up, one of the government's sort of central slogans. What do you say to a listener who says, given the news this week, that they just feel there isn't anything in levelling up when you get a reversal like this? There's a great quote from your colleague, Hugh Merriman, Conservative MP, who chairs the Transport Select Committee, who he said that this announcement this week showed the danger of selling perpetual sunlight and leaving it to others to explain the moonlight.
Well, Hugh is a great friend of mine, but he has certainly different views from Boris Johnson over Brexit. He's also chairman of the Transport Committee and is fully committed to HS2. But, you know, the other proposals that are being suggested, and I could go into great detail, but I think it'll be boring, actually mean that journey times from the northeast will still be cut. And more importantly, will be delivered, you know, for a cheaper cost and within 5 to 10 years, as opposed to waiting 20 or 30 years.
OK. Thank you. Francis O'Grady.
Well, lots of debate about the routes, lots of debate about the design, but I think what's clear is that HS2 was absolutely critical to improving our railway system and to boosting our economy. One of the reasons unions supported it was that whenever you open a new line, almost like a fast lane, if you like, on top of the upgrades of the local lines that we need, you attract investment, and that means jobs and livelihoods. And the second big reason, of course, is climate change, that we've got to get more people off the roads and onto public transport, whether that's rail or buses, whatever. We have got to shift that traffic. And what I find difficult, I'll be honest, from ministers over this week, has been it's pretty clear to me that the North and parts of the Midlands have been given something which is second best. They've been, in fact, some might say, they've been well and truly shafted. And I think dressing it up, trying to dress up a second best plan as somehow as good as the one that was in front of people right up until this year. The Prime Minister was still promising that this plan was going to be delivered in full, and then he pulls the rug. And I think it's an insult to our intelligence to pretend that we're getting as good as what we were promised.
Thank you, Francis. To Shabana and to Geoff in a second. Back to our questioner, though, Deborah. I wonder how you reflect on the theme itself. We got a sense of it from your question. What were your broader senses?
I've got so many concerns that the idea that we are going to have a net gain of jobs, that is not happening because we've already got plenty of vacancies which are unfilled as it is. When it comes to, the railway will cut down our CO2 emissions, the cement that is going to be used will actually raise it and also damage our aquifers, underground water systems, to such an extent that we might have floods in certain places and we might have dry rivers in others as the water is pushed in the wrong directions. That's on top of the fact that local businesses will not be able to move around successfully for 7 to 10 years, and we are going to lose an awful lot of our green spaces, our green sites, and the basic welfare and health of those the people who are in the firing line of this railway.
Deborah, I appreciate it. I'll chalk you up as a sceptic. Geoff Norcott.
Well, I think only this government, given the few weeks that they've had, could spend 96 billion quid and upset more or less everybody. You know, it's quite a lot of money. I mean, your colleague, Mr. Merriman, who made this analogy about moonlight and sunlight. I think somebody on Twitter said to me earlier, it's like being promised a Ferrari and then getting a Ford Cortina. Albeit quite an expensive Ford Cortina. And that's my point in a way, is that this is one of the problems with the current Conservative communications, is I suspect if this plan, as Michael rightly says, it does have benefits in terms of travels from the Midland to the North East. If this had been the first plan that had been put before people, it might have actually got some decent press. But as we know, Boris, he likes, islands, bridges, big, exciting stuff. But, sometimes it's about getting down into the nitty-gritty of what's deliverable. And you could easily have been looking at a week for the Conservatives here where they were getting praise for a travel plan rather than criticism. And I would add just one more thing, is there does seem to be an obsession in this country with rail, which is going up and down. I think there's a lot of people in the country that would like a bit of side to side. I'm a simple man, but...
Labour MP Shabana Mahmood, is there something in what Geoff says there? That if this had been the initial announcement, it would look like a lot of money going into a very big upgrade of the railway?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things I'd say to that. Firstly, the most important thing about the original promise made around this plan, around the eastern leg of HS2 and Northern Powerhouse Rail, is that it was supposed to increase capacity. So we're not actually just talking about journey times and so on, but actually having more lines so that you increase capacity. That is how you get the economic gains that were attached to this proposal. So with the best will in the world, if this had been the original plan, the argument would have been around capacity still. So this, as the original plan, would have still fallen short. Secondly, I would say that the 96 billion, that is actually largely made up of money that's already being spent on HS2 and nowhere near the north where it was, how it was all being dressed up by the Prime Minister yesterday. He could have done himself a lot of good and a bit of a favour and maybe got a hearing from people in Yorkshire in particular, but other parts of the North and the Midlands, if he had just been honest with everybody that this was a broken promise and that they were getting something different to to what had been promised, but he seems to have spent most of the day yesterday pretending that the plan is exactly what had already always been envisaged, and somehow it's only partisan point scoring that's saying, in fact, you've betrayed the North. And I think that just adds a layer of insult to injury that people are rightly really frustrated and angry about. It's a betrayal, and now on top of that, he's acting as if there's no broken promise at all, which is just not on.
Michael, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to agree with Shabana on the subject of capacity, because those of you with long memories will recall that it was all about speed, 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 and then it became capacity because more and more people were using the railways. But that does beg the question, will people still be using the railways post-COVID, 5 years, 10 years from now, that were using it pre-COVID? Because I would argue that although we are going back to a sort of normality, many people I know are only working 2 or 3 days a week, if that, from an office. So maybe the capacity argument no longer holds.
With the best will in the world, Michael, it does, because the demand is already there. There is a desperation for an increase in capacity, and all of the forecasts from everybody that's looked at this says that demand will increase. And if you're looking at a city like Bradford, it's one of the youngest cities in the country and in Europe. The demand is only going to increase, and the problem around capacity will remain until somebody builds some more lines.
Francis?
And it's not just about people. Let's not forget this is about freight as well, and that's absolutely critical for our economy. But also, I don't think it should be either or. I think we should be upgrading our broadband too. You know, that would help a lot of jobs and businesses if we could get that one right.
There's a question I'm interested in with Michael, because obviously, you know, a lot of your Conservative colleagues are, you know, so we say cautious around spending, and we do have what is essentially a very high-spending Conservative government. Isn't there an increasing frustration that they are laying down money, you know, big money, historically, even going back to the back end of the last Labour government, but they seem to be getting all the bad press in terms of the way it's handled? Aren't you, yourself, and your colleagues getting increasingly frustrated?
Yeah, we're getting very frustrated about that. And, Geoff, you are right, because if we'd said in the first place what we were going to do, and someone in the answer to the question was saying we need more east-west, and part of that 96 billion includes east-west corridors. So I think it's a good plan. And actually, Douglas Oakervee, who looked at this thing 2 years ago, said there could be alternative ways of actually delivering high speed to the northeast. And I just wish 2 years ago we'd said, well, let's go for that.
I think this service terminates here. We'll move on to a different question. If you'd like to get stuck into the Saturday afternoon conversation on any answers, here's how. You can ring 03700 100 444, 03700 100 444. You can call from 12:30. Anita is here on Radio 4 every Saturday afternoon at 2. Paul Eden has our next question. Hi, Paul.
Good evening. My question is, do the panel think that the forthcoming increase in our personal taxation will fix our broken social care system?
Thank you. So this is the plan that is going to involve higher taxes to pay for social care in England. And then in particular, there was news this week that will mean that those with fewer assets will actually be paying more than it originally looked like they might be, which caused something of a discussion. Shabana, first on this.
Well, the short answer to your question, Paul, is no. The increase in taxation is not going to lead to a fairer social care system. The test that the Prime Minister gave for his own plan was that nobody would have to sell their home in order to pay for their social care. That is not true. And the changes that were slightly snuck out under the cover of the other row that the government's having, in addition to rail, around corruption and second jobs in Parliament, those changes are now proof that actually, if you are asset poor, if your assets are worth less money, particularly if you live in the north and some parts of the Midlands, compared to whether you live in the south, then you are going to end up paying more. And Andrew Dilnott, who at the beginning of the 2010s wrote some of these proposals and looked deeply into issues around the care system, he confirmed when he was giving evidence yesterday to the Treasury Select Committee that if you are on modest and lower incomes, these these plans do not help you at all when it comes to not facing catastrophic costs for your social care. If you're on about £106,000 worth of assets, you are going to be treated very, very harshly under this new system. So that everything the Prime Minister said about his social care plan being fairer and meaning you don't have to sell your home, I'm afraid has proved to be another broken promise.
Is it not fairer, though, than the existing system? I know you're arguing that it's not as fair as it originally looked, but is it not fairer than the existing system?
Well, actually, people are obviously running the figures on what these changes that the government has announced, and which I think will be voted on in the House of Commons next week, what they actually mean. But the initial figures suggest that actually you're only about £6,000 better off under this new system than you were under the previous system. That means that under the previous system, you had to run down your assets to about £14,000 before additional help would kick in, and now that's maybe £20,000. I would say that the revolutionary plan to save social care in this country, only yielding people being £6,000 better off, is definitely evidence of a broken promise. The fact of the matter is the net effect of the changes that have been announced means that if you are living in the south and you are better off and your assets are worth more, your assets are going to be protected as a result of these measures. But if you're living in other parts of the country, particularly in the north, where your assets aren't as high value, then you will be absolutely clobbered when it comes to your social care costs.
Thank you. Just to pick through some of the numbers here to explain to our listener what is happening here. So in September, the government announced a cap on lifetime care costs in England of £86,000 from October of 2023, and financial help for people with assets lower than £100,000. But this new detail has shown how these two things will work together, which plenty of critics are saying will have a disproportionate impact on those with a smaller amount of money, so fewer assets. Let's go to Geoff next.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just often, a lot of the country are wondering, and this isn't like meant to be a provocative question, but what would Labour do? That's a big question at the moment. I mean, you mentioned the north and south divide. I mean, there are still properties in the north that are quite valuable. I don't know how you address that, or how. I understand that the Labour Party want to get all sorts of attacks in over the Tories' credibility in the north at the moment, but I don't understand how you would address that in a fair care system. And if you're saying that it's a drop in the ocean, this income tax rise, and how it would be spent on social care, what do you think? What kind of rises in personal taxation would someone like me need to be looking at?
So we have our own plan for social care. We want to be focusing much more on early intervention and prevention, because those changes actually save a lot of money in the system. We have a home first approach. We would pay more for adaptations in order to save money. These things actually yield big savings if you do them well and if you do them right.
And who would pay
but there is an issue around taxation. Taxes do have to rise in order to pay for social care, but we believe there are much fairer ways of doing that. Rather than loading the burden on to working age people, we would look at fairer tax changes. We would look at other ways, equalising the treatment of taxation of different forms of income, for example. So at the moment, shares and dividends, and if you have a multiple property portfolio, the way that your income from those sources is taxed is very different to, if you just work and earn through PAYE. So we would look at all of those things as different ways of raising the money. We know revenue has to be raised, but the Tory party is going about it in completely the wrong way, loading the burden onto working people and not even fixing the problem of social care.
Thank you. Conservative MP Michael Fabricant, is this another government promise biting the dust?
No, I don't think it is. Look, I remember Andy Burnham with the Labour government wanted to fix social care, that's in inverted commas, and, it couldn't be done. And to answer the questioner direct, no, it won't fix social care in the sense that everyone will have to pay something if their assets are above £100,000. But before we poo-poo it, it does mean that whereas previously anybody with 23,000 or over didn't get help, it's now gone right up to £100,000, and they will receive some sort of assistance up to having assets of up to £100,000. And it does mean that you won't be paying more than £86,000, in your care. Now, that's £86,000 too much, but I haven't actually heard any sensible practical suggestion, either from Labour when they were in government, and certainly not Labour now, because they say, oh, we'll only give our figures away just before a general election. I've heard no solution as to where the money's coming from.
Thank you. Let's return to Paul, our questioner, because, Paul, I think you're the owner of a care home. Is that right? Can we return the microphone to Paul?
Actually, no. I own a company that provides care for people in their own homes, with my lovely wife sat just behind me.
And when you reflect on this debate as someone who is closer to it than perhaps we are on the panel here, how do you wrestle with your own question?
I wrestle with my own question from a slightly different angle, is that all of this money is being promised and big numbers are being bandied about as being thrown at health and social care. The problem is, at the sharp end, we don't get to see it. By the time all of the bureaucracy is kicked in with the local authority, the amount that a care company such as mine is paid to work with the local authority doesn't even cover the forthcoming increase in minimum wage.
Okay.
So I'm now going to be subsidising the local authority if I choose to contract with them, which I'm not at the moment, but I'm now going to be subsidising that provision of care with my money, paying for the lack of funding that's come in centrally with the forthcoming increase in minimum wage. And it just funds a race to the bottom in standards, in culture, and makes people that work in social care feel pretty awful.
Thank you, Paul. Francis O'Grady of the TUC.
You see, I feel that most of us, any of us who've had a mum or a dad in social care, and all of us are going to come to this at some point, we all understand maybe we need to pay a little bit more. But there is a sense that it's got to be fair and that it's got to make a difference on the ground, exactly as we heard, because given everything we've been through with this pandemic, and we've seen what's happened to care workers and those running care homes, and how they were on the front line, often not even with good enough PPE at the start of this pandemic. And, the majority of care workers in this country earn less than £10 an hour. And that I think most of us feel ashamed of that. We know it's wrong. We see the dedication, we see the commitment. And I think we have to start with improving conditions, including fair rewards for the dedicated people who work in this system.
How?
To do this, the TUC has been suggesting, before we start knocking on the door of working families, because we all know now, we've discovered that the national insurance contribution increase is actually going to hit low-paid and young workers harder than anybody else. That doesn't feel right. So let's look at wealth taxes. There's been a proposal that could raise £17 billion. Let's look at that, taxing estate and wealth. Those with the broadest shoulders should pay the most. And I'll tell you something else. There's a very mixed picture in social care. We've got some dedicated family firms, really dedicated. And then we've got a lot of private equity-owned chains. And I think it is absolutely wrong that the owner of one of those private equity chains, the private equity chief, is under these plans going to be paying a lower rate of tax than the low-paid dedicated care workers looking after our families.
A quick word, Francis, before we move on the subject of tax, because the tax burden is, by historic standards, huge at the moment, and you're suggesting it should be bigger.
I'm suggesting it should be fair. I'm saying, you've got to win our trust as a government. I'm sorry, but you've got to win our trust that this isn't just about hammering ordinary people again. We've got inflation rising. We've got real wages projected by the Chancellor himself in his own budget. Real wages are going to fall next year. Mm-hmm. How are people supposed to keep digging deeper when there's nothing left? Okay. So we're going to have to look at fair taxes before you come knocking on the doors of working people.
Thank you. It's Any Questions on Radio 4 from Stoke this weekend. I'm Chris Mason, and Haj Nahal has our next question. Hello.
Good evening, panel. How should English cricket move forward and restore cricket fans' faith and love in the game?
Thank you. Shabana Mahmood first on this.
I think that they'll need a targeted plan of rebuilding the trust, and it comes firstly from acknowledging the scale of the problem and acknowledging that it runs through English cricket. And obviously there's been the meeting of the various counties today. I, like a lot of people, watching Azim Rafiq's testimony before the House of Commons earlier in the week was just completely horrifying and appalling. And I found myself actually for the first time hearing from my dad and others in my family about their experiences of being called, I won't say it here, but the P word as young men. And these are people who've never spoken about their experiences of racism because they've completely internalized it and try to ignore it. And hearing somebody speak, with so much emotion on TV about it and the impact that it had has obviously had a much wider impact as well. And I've seen that in my own family. So it's completely horrifying. I think that the way that Yorkshire initially dealt with these allegations, I think they've rightly effectively called themselves out and have promised that they're going to turn the page. And I've been very impressed with what Lord Patel, who's now in charge over at Yorkshire, has had to say about the way that Yorkshire themselves are going to approach this. And I hope that that's the approach actually that the English Cricket Board take as well. I think it's such a shame actually because cricket can be a real unifier. If you think about the sorts of people that love the game, the history of the game, the heritage, the way it's played on the subcontinent and in the Caribbean, and the communities from those parts of the world who've made this country their home and who now consider themselves as British as anybody else. Cricket can be a real force for explaining the history and heritage of immigration in this country, and it's a real tragedy actually what's happened, and it's a real tragedy what Azim Rafiq has exposed.
I wonder, sorry to interrupt, it's fascinating hearing your testimony for obvious reasons as a woman of an ethnic minority, and clearly so many people will have been horrified at what they've heard this week, but I just wonder from your perspective how surprised you were.
Oh, well, if I'm very honest, probably not very surprised. And it pains me to say that, really, because I don't wish to paint a picture that we're just overwhelmed with racism at every stage and at every moment, because I don't think that's a fair reflection of who we are as a country. The vast majority of people in our country are decent and, treat other people the way they wish to be treated themselves. But, racism is this pernicious thing, and it can take hold and it can build a culture of what is considered normal behaviour. And the normalcy of that behaviour makes it really difficult to call out. Azim Rafiq has spoken so powerfully about the cost that you pay when you call it out, and you're taking on people that might have thought you were their friend and that you didn't really mind, and then you feel like maybe you're a bit of a troublemaker. All those things go through your mind when you raise a complaint, and it's really difficult to get the balance. So we know these problems exist in our society, and we know that the culture can take hold in sport and in businesses and in lots of places, and it should be called out and it has to be dealt with. But you want to balance that against the fact that most people in our country are decent and do want to be positive about these matters, and getting that balance right I think is quite difficult, but it's something we've all got to strive for, because it's as lots of people have said this week, it's everybody's business. It's not just for those of us who are a different colour to the majority, it's actually for all of us to work together to find solutions to these problems.
I just wonder finally, before I move on to your fellow panellists, how often you personally encounter racism, whether it be face to face or perhaps on social media or via mail. I just wonder how bad is it, and is it more frequent than it used to be or less?
I think in my own life and in my own experience, it has been a feature of my life before I became a politician, and quite a lot since I've become a politician. I'd say it's got much worse in the last few years, and I think that's mostly most politicians' experience of social media, is that there's just much more abuse and derogatory language around. And if you happen to be brown and Muslim like me, unfortunately you cover quite a few of the characteristics that lots of hate accounts on social media like to target. So I've had much more experience of it in recent years. But as I say, it's when you speak about your experiences, if you're a person like me with a public platform, it is about getting that balance right, because I've also, having had those terrible experiences, received a huge amount of support from people, from my white colleagues who have supported me as well. And you want to be able to call out the bad behaviour, but also encourage those who are trying to do the right thing, who want to be a force for positive change, and so that you can get that balance right. I think it's incredibly difficult.
Thank you. Conservative MP Michael Fabricant, Harge asking, how should English cricket move forward and restore the fans' love and faith in the game?
Well, I think Shabana actually has answered the question. I think the balance is very, very important, though. I'm just slightly concerned that we don't go... We heard very moving testimony earlier on, but I just want to say, really, and I'll give you a personal experience in a moment, I just don't want us to go down a witch hunt direction. And what I mean by that is, we're absolutely right to call out what happened with the cricket, but I've got a horrible feeling if we're not careful, maybe not so much through social media, but some of the journalists who'll be digging around will start picking on other sportsmen about what they might have done 10 or 20 years ago. There's no excuse for racism, but the case recently of the guy who blacked up his face, was he being racist, or was he just, being a youngster, not thinking too cleverly about it? I'm not practicing, but I'm of Jewish extraction. I mean, most people don't know that because I'm quite fair. But, when I was at school, there were sometimes odd comments made, but I don't think they were racist comments. I don't think they were anti-Semitic comments. I think it's just because sometimes people pick out differences. I remember a boy at school was persecuted because he had big ears and was called jug handles. Now, this is not the same as racism, of course not, but it's all a question of getting the balance right and making sure that we don't end up, as I say, by victimizing maybe those people who are not remotely racist, but, have behaved in a way that wasn't really appropriate. But in this instance, it's quite clear that in cricket there is a severe problem, or has been.
Francis O'Grady of the TUC.
Well, I think my starting point is always that it shouldn't matter what background any of us come from, what race or religion, that we all have a right to be treated with dignity and respect at work. And I think that we should all send our support and solidarity to Azim, because I think it takes guts to speak up. Any of us who have been through any form of bullying at work will know it takes guts to get up and say what's happened to you, because you're reliving that trauma and it's tough. But what struck me, and what I also really took from what Azim said, was that he didn't want it to be just about individuals or whether or not this was dressing room banter. He wanted to look at the system and the structure that had allowed that to happen, because the hard truth is, I think that the ECB, this isn't my sport, by the way, I'm not a cricket, I'm a footy fan, so I'm a bit out of my depth on some of this, but the board, looked the other way, basically. It looked the other way. And there seems to be this massive gap, which you don't get in the same way in football, I think. But a massive gap between what was happening at the grassroots, where there is really multiracial and everybody's, really up for getting on with the game. And then what was happening when it came to test cricket and professional cricket, and not just in terms of race. I think it's kind of pretty public school dominated as well, which might, the two go together. So I think then the first thing we have to do is be honest about this. I think absolutely most people in Britain are decent. They don't want to see this continue. We don't want it to happen in any workplace, but it does mean we've got to recognise that it is still the case in Britain that black and ethnic minority workers are more likely to suffer unemployment, last in, first out, more likely to be on a 0 hours contract, more likely to be on low pay, more likely to get stopped and searched. So we've got some issues that we have got to take action on. But I think there are enough good people of goodwill to make sure that we use this as an opportunity to end racism once and for all.
Francis, I noticed in your answer there, you talked about any of us who have experienced bullying at work. I don't know if that was a personal reflection. Is it something you've encountered personally?
Certainly, as a union rep, I've represented people, and I know it's taken hours and hours for people to feel confident enough to report it, including, I have to say, sexual harassment.
Okay. I was agreeing with everything Francis said until you said public schools. Are you suggesting public schools are more racist than state schools? And by the way, I went to a state school.
No, I saw a report that public school students it was something like 6 times as likely to be in Test cricket than in the general population.
Okay.
Somebody else will help me out here, but it looked weird to me. It was like, why is that happening? Surely it should reflect the population as we are.
Thank you. Geoff Norcott.
Yeah, I think, for anybody that loves cricket, it was a really sobering week. I was aware that the testimony was likely to be explosive. I did have it in mind that there were going to be people that were spoken about that contested some of these claims, and we do have sort of due process. But I think it became very clear early on, listening to Mr. Rafiq speak, that he seemed a credible person. You just bought into what he was saying. Interestingly, there were certain things that were so specific. I think, this use of the word Kevin for any non-white people, those are those strange things when you're hearing a testimony that really make you buy in. I think that, and I think it's important to say this, and this is not to disparage anything that Mr. Rafiq said, but he obviously had skeletons in his own closet in terms of anti-Semitic remarks. And I'm not saying that in any way changes anything he said, but I think it's really important for the Jewish community in this country for that to feel like it wasn't glossed over. Now, he did say those when he was a lot younger. He was 19, and I do think that matters, and he has given a full and clear apology. But what he spoke about in terms of the racist abuse and just how long it took for it to be heard. And, there's sometimes as you grow up, you talk about things where you say, well, that was in another time. This didn't happen in another time, did it? I mean, we're talking about things that happened in the last few years. So, it's unacceptable. I love cricket, and, I just hope, like a lot of people that feel passionately about the game, that this has been, a terrible week, but it could be the start of a reckoning and something more positive.
Shabana, your hand was up.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow on from what Geoff said about the anti-Semitic remarks made by Azim Rafiq and what that might teach us about the broader, things that have come to light about racism in cricket. Because one of the ways you move on is people acknowledge a mistake was made, and then they make a genuine apology, and then that apology is accepted. And in good faith, both parties seek to move forward, having learned a lesson. And that's how you can avoid these things feeling like a witch hunt. I think if any of those players or people at Yorkshire had actually acknowledged that a mistake had been made, that there were problems, apologised fulsomely, that would have been accepted. And I actually think that the response of the Jewish communal organisations to Azim Rafiq's apology is really something that's touched my heart, because they've accepted it in a spirit of warmth, because they realise it's a genuine apology, and they want to use it as a way of teaching other people of how to move on from these sorts of episodes.
Thank you. Some of the leading voices in cricket meeting saying that they apologise unreservedly, that discrimination is a blight on the game, and the chief executive of the England and Wales Cricket Board saying our game must win back your trust. 03700 100 444 for any answers. And Dr. Kat Anderson with our next question. Hello.
Good evening, panel. Despite shouldering 90% of NHS healthcare provision, GPs are continually criticised. What does the panel think will ensure that GPs want to stay in the profession instead of leaving in their droves?
And as I introduced you, I said Dr. Kat Anderson. So bring us your perspective. You're a GP, yeah?
I am a GP, and unfortunately morale has never been lower. We are busier than we ever have been. We know that we provide 90% of NHS care on 8 to 10% of the NHS budget. We know that we are operating at nearly 200% beyond capacity, and demand is completely outstripping supply. We're doing our best. We've worked flat out for 2 years throughout the pandemic. We were in crisis beforehand, and things have got worse. Unfortunately, people are leaving, doctors are leaving, nurses are leaving, because the heat has got too much in the kitchen.
And in a sentence, how close are you to packing it in?
I don't think I'd be surviving if I hadn't already started working part-time in the private sector. So I'm part-time NHS, part-time private. I could not tolerate to be fully NHS any longer.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. Michael Fabricant, Conservative MP.
Well, I have many friends in the medical profession, and at one time I actually was thinking of becoming a GP when I was at university, so I do know the problems. I think it's actually multifaceted. I mean, I could give you the stats. There are going to be 1,000 800 more GPs and £530 million has been given to the GPs, to help.
A shake of the head from Dr. Anderson, I see. A shake of the head from Dr. Anderson, I see on the front row.
Right, well, anyway, but those are the stats. But, the reality is that it takes 5 years, as you know, through medical school, 6 years if you haven't done pre-med 1, then you've got to do your clinical experience, and I do know some of this from my personal experience. I think we also need to change our attitudes in Britain anyway as patients. Too often I think people go to GPs in this country where they wouldn't do so in France or Germany, when they could equally as well, better some might say, go to pharmacists who also get a 3 or 4 year training and can also prescribe drugs. You get people who make appointments with GPs who don't turn up. In France, they've solved that problem. They charge, I believe, something like €36 to see a GP, even though they have a National Health Service. And if you turn up, you get €18 back.
Is that a good idea?
Well, it's certainly not government policy, but actually, I think if there were some incentive to get people not to cancel appointments with GPs and dentists and other medical professionals, it would take some of the strain out of the system. I think part of the problem in this country is because it's free at the point of delivery, some people think it's, quote, worthless, unquote. And the fact that in Europe you do pay something, you do realise there is value to this. No, I, as I said earlier, I've got many friends who are like you. I'm looking at the lady in the audience, the GP, also pretty fed up. It has been made more complicated by COVID. The strain is immense, but there are no easy solutions. Okay. But I do think we should be training the population in how better to use medical services in this country.
Francis O'Grady next.
I've got different statistics to Michael. My understanding is that there are 1,000 fewer GPs over the last 5 years. So despite the targets, which I'm sure are welcome, we're not replacing the people who are retiring and leaving. So that's, cranking up the pressure even more. And I think lots of us will have had that experience of the frustration of trying to get an appointment, which isn't always easy. And, of course, we're doing that against the backdrop of the pandemic and an enormous backlog of people having stayed away for quite a long time and now trying to get health issues sorted. Mm-hmm. I tell you what worries me, though, is, again, it's this sort of blame game that we see that, we shouldn't forget GPs, along with all our health worker team, they were on the front line. They've had no respite at all through one of the most, not just physically exhausting,
who's blaming them?
But emotionally exhausting. I'm afraid I've heard some ministers pointing the fingers at GPs and whether or not they should be doing face-to-face appointments and all of that. That's happening all the time. But instead of doing that, I think we need a real workforce plan now for the NHS and the wider social care system. We've got to stop blaming and start recruiting and holding on to the precious trained professionals that we have.
Geoff Norcott, Dr. Anderson says, why are lots of doctors leaving in droves and what needs to change?
Well, that's a question I actually wanted to ask back. I mean, some of it is to do with the workload you're experiencing now, but I'm reading reports about there's an antipathy between GP surgeries and the public. Is that something that you're experiencing?
That's very true. We are feeling very, very criticised by the media, by the Daily Mail, by other, sort of media outlets. We are seeing patients face-to-face. Yes, we are telephone triaging to try and speed things up because the demand is outstripping supply. And yes, I'd like to say that Francis O'Grady was absolutely right, that although Jeremy Hunt promised 5,000 extra GPs when he was health minister, and he delivered that, unfortunately over 6,000 left due to retiring early and
But I mean, I can, you know, at the risk of being unpopular, I can represent the public point of view, and anecdotally, there is a frustration with people that feel, obviously, you know, people weren't able to get appointments virtually at all during the period where there was lockdown. Now, it may well be that GPs were doing other work, and maybe that's information that needs to be disseminated. But the feeling, you know, I can represent it, is sometimes that people are being held at arm's length. Is it just an issue of workload, or is there a desire to take some of the drop in intensity in GP's workload and carry that forward beyond the pandemic?
Briefly, Doctor.
There's no drop in intensity. The intensity has cranked up. We have been busy. I took the afternoon off this afternoon so I could get here on time. That gives you some idea. We're talking 12-hour days, not any lunch breaks. It's difficult to even get a toilet break. We are seeing patients all day long, and then we have hours of admin afterwards.
Thank you. Shabana Mahmood.
So I tend to agree with much of what Francis said. I see this as a constituency MP from both sides of the equation. I know that the pressures in the National Health Service were there long before COVID, but have obviously been exacerbated as a result of the pandemic. And Michael, I'm afraid you're wrong on the figures. Francis was right, as was Dr. Anderson. There are 1,000 fewer, because even though there were some new recruits brought into the system, that did not replace those who were leaving the system at the same time. So we've had this build-up of shortages and a beds crisis and other vacancies going unfilled in the NHS long before the pandemic hit. But then also as a constituency MP, I know that my constituents are frustrated because they're struggling to get face-to-face appointments. And I just earlier on today I had an email from a constituent who's worried about getting treatment for their parents and worried that there might be a bigger problem that's being missed because they can't see somebody face-to-face. So I see it from all sides. I think that it's important that we drop the rhetoric and stop trying to pit people against one another and suggest that doctors are public enemy number one and that they just earn lots of money and have become quite lazy over the pandemic. I think that's the subtext of how some of the reporting has taken place and some of the ill-tempered remarks that have been made. I think it's on the government to come forward with a proper plan to deal with labour force shortages in the National Health Service to make sure everybody can get the treatment that they need.
Thank you. If you want to talk about GPs, ringing them up to get an appointment or your experience in the last few months or during the pandemic, 03700 100 444 on any answers. In a fortnight's time, we're going to be in Prestine in Powys. Next week takes us to Slough in Berkshire. From all of us here in Stoke-on-Trent, thank you for listening.